Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome everybody to Nightlight. It's so good to have you with us. We look forward to these 2-hour extravaganzas that Mark and I put together. I want to thank first off Ken Quiethawk for that amazing introductorytellers.com, amazing site, and a way of preserving history that a lot of us aren't familiar with, but should really get familiar with, because it does bring history forward in time and attach us to our past in a rather unique way. Also, a reminder that Monday night, Michael Cremo will be on Nightlight at 9 p.m. Eastern. But for today, we have a really super show. Mark has gotten award-winning filmmaker Frank Jacob to be with us, and you will be amazed at what he has done. So I'm going to bring Mark on. Hey, Mark, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Barbara?
Doing well.
Good. Yeah, I think maybe with the Serpent Mound seed blessing thing going on right now and tomorrow too, maybe we ought to just change our topic for today. Work in Ken's reference to unicorns, the Serpent Mound, and bears, and just have an animal-themed show.
Well, I got to tell you, the film that Frank is going to be talking about is material that is so near and dear to my heart, and it's material that isn't really, or has not been really, in the the common talk of most people, and yet it is material that is so important that people be aware of. And, if it just makes them think, it's okay if you even don't agree, so long as it makes you think about the possibility. It's a seed into your consciousness that is very important at these times.
Right. And, I think this afternoon show is going to lay the foundation for some upcoming shows, especially with the one in early first Tuesday of April. So, we have something really unique lined up for today, and if the audience is tired of March being an extra month of winter, or the chemtrails more related to the climate change than our way of life, are you ready for a vacation? Well, maybe you should consider Mars as a vacation destination. And Frank Jacob is our guest, and he's going to be discussing his role as being a writer, director, producer, and he also wrote the musical score for his movie Packing for Mars. This is a movie that won the People's Choice Award at the 2016 UFO Congress Film Festival, and it placed very highly in a very large number of submissions of movies at Munich's 2018 Cosmic Sin Film Festival, and Barbara and I really enjoyed it too. So, is the modern idea of visiting Mars based on real events from an ancient history? So, we're going to discuss that topic for the next couple hours with our guest, Frank Jacobs. So welcome, Frank. How are you?
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me, Mark. And hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Frank, have you any bears in at your place today?
Bears in the Bavarian Alps?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think they have any more of them this far down, fortunately. Well, or maybe not. I mean, I guess it'd be great to see a bear. We have deer.
Okay.
Yeah, deer, and they come, and we have squirrels that come scratching our windows.
I think we should let people know that shortly before the beginning of the show, I had a bear in my backyard, and I had to excuse myself so that I could go chase it out of the yard. That's what they're referring to. Doesn't everyone? I mean...
So some of the stuff that goes on, and it's always right before a show, something crazy like that happens, but it makes for a lively start to the show. But Frank, what as we get started talking about your movie Packing for Mars, why did you feel it was important to investigate this topic?
Well, I'd been given a book many years ago called Alternative 3. And the book was given to me by a fairly intelligent, interesting character who's into biodynamic farming and really well read on history. And on one of our visits with him, we got into this discussion about the state of the affairs on the planet. And then he pulls out this book, and he was saying how it's a book that's written as science fiction, that it was, but that it's actually not fiction, that it's true. And he let me have the book, and I took it with me. And the book actually is based on a screenplay that was a television show in England in 1977. And they called it also Alternative 3. And what made that interesting was that it was a weekly science magazine called Science Report that normally held to a factual narrative during their shows, reporting on the latest science and things that are in the world. And then for their sort of last show, they decided to, which they thought would be airing on April 1st, they decided to put together a spoof, so the story goes. And they wrote this crazy thriller about a breakaway colony on Mars. And Leslie Watkins, at the time, an English, really scholarly writer who was a Fleet Street reporter, heard that or saw that broadcast in a rare moment of having, not really being a TV person. He decided to look further into it and ended up getting his publisher to work with the screenwriters so that they could basically do a book version of the story. And his being a scholar who is a Fleet Street qualitative investigative reporter, he took the story so deep, going into missing persons, climate change, and the things that were the topics at the time, space, unexplained space phenomena. And he wrote really what is by today's standards still a real page-turning thriller. And I read it not thinking I was ever going to make a film out of it. But what's interesting about it is the book over 40 years ago was already talking about the kind of subject matter we hear in today's news all the time about, the climate change. And, and I'll put in a caveat here, just because I'm mentioning climate change and all these things doesn't necessarily mean I endorse the conventional view of climate change. So I'm just reporting it in a sense that climate change was a topic in the late 70s. It started to be a topic. There were a lot of prognostications of coming up to an ice age, and they were talking about the world in terms of population change and population reduction. And really actually very current and trendy subject matter for 40 years ago in today's perspective. So when I was looking to do a story or to do a film, let's just say, I was looking to get into doing a full-length documentary film. I'd been working at a network. I'd done a lot of shorter films, and I was looking for something that was a little bit crazy. And I'd forgotten about the book, and then one night I was surfing around and looking, and I'd actually recently come across the disclosure movement, and Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy were two people that had sort of grasped that idea and begun Project Camelot, which was interviewing a lot of people that were part of this thing called disclosure, which was revealing secret technology to us that apparently they were working on, which nobody here had ever heard about, because we'd been kind of raised in the conventional school system and society to believe in a certain fixed set of physics and limitations according to the speed of light, and the stuff that they were talking about obviously would be outside of those rules. And here was, I heard this interview with the great-granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower talking about being recruited for a Mars colony. And I thought, whoa, I was like, okay, the book was great, and I thought it had a certain viability to it, and I was intrigued by the story that, many researchers didn't believe it was a fiction. In fact, people like Mae Brussel, a very, very potent and dangerous investigative journalist in America, had the book in her library and called it the most dangerous book in her library. So having heard now all of a sudden in today's world this interview of a person representing themselves as the great-granddaughter of Dwight D. Eisenhower, like not just someone that you'd never heard of, but actually somebody that was part of the American aristocracy, you could say, alongside of a very intellectual and well-spoken attorney called, Andrew Bushago, I was intrigued, and I thought, okay, this is an interesting story, and it'd be cool to take this story of Alternative 3, which was already 40 years old, and put it into today's modern context. Is there really any evidence that there might be like this breakaway civilization which had set up a colony on the moon and actually had set up a colony on Mars in order to preserve the human race from doom and destruction? So that was the kind of reason why I think I felt motivated to do it. It's a crazy story. It's a very, very current topic in today's perspective of things, and I like crazy stories. And I also like the idea of things that are balancing the line between fiction and fact.
Okay. Well, early in the movie, you do give us examples where people aren't paying attention to things being hidden in plain sight. There's some of the destructive technologies. You're also looking at the pharmaceutical industry and chemtrails, nanotechnology and HARP and all that stuff.
Yes.
All these sciences that almost seem like they're being used as a weapon against us. What role is all of that material playing into, packing, colonizing from Mars, getting ready to leave the Earth?
Well, first of all, I'm not. The film doesn't really endorse us going to Mars at all, so much as it does say that there is a faction of people which may be actually already settled and set up on Mars in the event of a worst case scenario. So some of those things you were mentioning, like epidemics that are happening, the influence of pharmaceuticals in society is humongous. I mean, there's really not much people can do these days without somehow having the pharmaceutical corporations have their fingers in their world. Whether it's enrolling your child in a regular elementary school in America or in Canada, where there are cases where they won't let your child attend school unless they have a vaccination. And there's a lot of controversy around the safety of vaccinations. And then there's all these things going on in the skies above us that nobody officially has really ever acknowledged. They're still claiming that people who are mentioning things like chemtrails are wacky conspiracy theorists. I mean, I even had friends of my own that I was just putting posts up on Facebook, that were discussing some pretty hard, edgy evidence about chemtrails, and they just didn't want to go there. And they just think that you're crazy. If you're talking about this stuff, you're just crazy. You must be crazy. And my answer to this always is, that's cool that you're honest, but some of us have to be the crazy ones that are willing to go down that path to see if it really is just a hoax or if it's real. And if you're looking at the skies these days, and if you've been monitoring what's going on, you have to say there's definitely some really crazy things going on that are undeniable geoengineering programs, and now slowly and surely being dripped out even through the mainstream media, where now, Harvard researchers are coming out with little droplets saying, oh, yes, we're going to be trying our first, climate change reduction experiment where we can fertilize the skies with very finely dispersed carbon and things like that. And you're going, really? Okay, now you sort of see that these things kind of they get put out there and they get put and used and utilized, and when enough people start an outcry about it, then all of a sudden the academics and the mainstream jumps on and just drips this information out like it's something we need to do, so that when they finally come clean with having done these experiments through more or less some kind of academic consensus, then they can wave aside all the conspiracy theorists. So that kind of stuff is going on in the world. And what else we talk about is just really like HAARP. There's a lot of evidence that for the last 50 or so years there's been some major technological developments going on both sides of the globe, in Russia and in America. At a certain point there really isn't nationality any longer. There's a supranational collective of people that are interested and studying and collaborating on global issues that go beyond the borders. And things like HAARP and weather manipulation and weather control are those kinds of things, whether they're using them altruistically to really truly stop climate change, which, a lot of people will put a lot of evidence in front of you. Thousands and thousands of scientists will sign papers saying the whole thing about man-made carbon emissions causing greenhouse effect is completely unfounded. There's no evidence of it. It's just bogus. And the others that are on the other camp saying, yes, there is climate change. I have a lot of friends that believe in this. There's climate change going on. They're not stupid people. There is climate change going on. But if you look back even to the days of Genghis Khan, there were certain parts of the Alps that were completely uncovered. There was no snow, no ice whatsoever, that are now completely frosted over. So how far back do you want to go to look at climate change? Because I think you can show very clearly that there's been some very, very strange climates that have happened on planet Earth for the last few hundreds of years, but man has nothing to do with them. So where it's all going, where I'm going with this is essentially that it's got to do with manipulation on a very large scale of society by an elite few that have some kind of agenda.
Okay, well, there was the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago,
right?
Just another example, and I just wonder what's the purpose of all the tic-tac patterns in the sky. They just kind of appear every few days over your house. That just doesn't seem normal. Is that creating the next ice age? I don't know. I don't know either. It's just there's the evidence. A lot of people talk about it. So do we know who is behind this misuse of technology? Is it just a few of the global elite families?
Well, that's the big question that I think a lot of people are trying to get an answer to. Now, I mean, there's all kinds of different angles on this. There's some people that will say it's this cabal of 13 families that have been kind of shepherding us through history, gradually and slowly controlling society through social engineering projects that they are funding, that they are in control of. And their agenda in terms of bloodlines, and their agenda in terms of, I guess, world hegemony, having dominion over the planet, that sort of falls into this picture of like the Georgia Guidestones, if you've ever heard of those. Have you heard of the Georgia? Yeah, I mean, the Georgia Guidestones are pretty scary. If you look at those kind of numbers, like that would mean a reduction of the population on the magnitude of several billion to achieve that goal. And how would that be done, right? And I mean, you'd have to think, okay, well, what would we do to eliminate 6.5 billion people on the planet to have this sort of haven?
Who's going to decide who lives and dies?
And who's going to decide who lives and dies? And then there's the other side of things, which people are talking about, which discuss this on an extraterrestrial level, that history and wars are not actually fought because of agendas that were human-made, but because of agendas that were manipulated by extraterrestrials, and that the extraterrestrial factions that are on Earth themselves are warring, and we are their kind of de facto puppet armies that will fight these wars and create this chaos on the planet for on behalf of their agendas. And the two main, I think one of the main bad characters that comes out in this extraterrestrial view of things is the reptilians, the reptiles, as people like to always, the draconians, or whatever you want to call them.
Okay, so are the reptilians, or which species has had the colony established on Mars? So let's get us up to that planet. Where does all this information fit in?
Well, it depends how far you go back. What we're finding on Mars now, or at least those of us and those researchers who are willing to analyze the data, which is coming back in fragments filtered through NASA and JPL and all these other, controlling elements. But nonetheless, there's stuff that's dripping through, there's stuff that's leaking through that shows clear evidence of an ancient civilization on the surface of Mars. And, nobody knows who this civilization was. However, there's been some very interesting theories that have been proposed lately that the inhabitants of Mars actually have a lot in common with humans. And I think, Michael Salla, for example, a really great author, he's written a lot about, he's sort of allied with the information that Bill Tompkins was bringing out, and with Corey Goode, and some of these people that were talking about the arrival about 60,000 years ago on Earth of these Martians with advanced technology that had escaped some catastrophe that was taking place on Mars and settled in Antarctica. And they are now finding remnants on Antarctica deep under the frozen ice, archaeological remnants, species, settlements, technology, which goes back to Mars. Now, I haven't been there personally, And I do hold a lot of credibility to Michael Sala's work, and I do think there's a lot of credibility to something strange going on in Antarctica. I don't know how much of it is Martians, but what I find very interesting is the appearance of pyramids on the surface of Mars. And in Packing for Mars, we show you some of those pyramids. And we have J.J. Hertog, who's probably one of the first people, really, the first research to come out, I think, maybe 20 or 30 years ago already, with information relative to colonization, archaeological remnants found on Mars. And he was virtually ignored at the time. We have him talking about this in Packing for Mars, and he puts a lot of very interesting correlations between Mars and Earth into what he gave us in the interview. For example, like Cairo, the foundation of Cairo, the name Cairo actually can translate to Mars. And the foundations of some of the perimeters in Cairo line up with certain geological configurations on the surface of Mars. So there seems to be, and there's over 369 words in the English language that relate to Mars. So there seems to be some very, very deep correlation archaeologically between Earth and Mars that go back a long, long time. I don't know where the reptilians play into this. I mean, a lot of people basically refer to the reptilians as some evil species that arrived here from some war in Orion, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they came here and they basically, dominated the planet. There's some version of the story that they connected with Nazi Germany, and that they connected with Hitler, and they presented them with advanced technology for them to take over the planet. There's that whole story, and I'm over in Germany researching a lot of that now, trying to find evidence of whether that's true or not. And but I don't hold a lot of credibility to that version of the story for various reasons. Maybe we can get into them a little bit later. I'll just briefly touch on it now. Or that the reptilians, fought with the Martians, and that there's been this constant war. There's also another author in Germany that has basically brought out these chronicles documenting his actual experience of being taken into the inner Earth. And in the inner Earth, he talks about a series of species that withdrew into the inner Earth, and one of them are the reptilians. Now, the reptilians he's talking about, they don't sound as nasty and vicious as the reptilians that are portrayed in, like the Wachowski brother films, like Jupiter Rising or whatever. They're a different kind of, and they look more human than you would think. In fact, they basically look very humanoid, but they have a scaly-like skin. And it's very interesting because if you look back in history, there is direct reference to scaly-skinned organisms which appear in the mythology of the Zulus, and they appear in the mythology of some of the information that was deciphered from the temples in Tiahuanaca. And we found some interesting archaeological alignments with Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, as they call it, that show the relation between the positioning of the pyramids in that plaza and to be in direct correlation to Mars and Earth. So it's very, very, there's a lot of really powerful and interesting archaeological evidence. You don't even have to go far out in terms of being conspiracy oriented to find traces or very uncanny coincidences that document our relationship between Mars and our civilization.
Frank, you just mentioned, the pyramids on Mars and some of the Central American sites. It just seems like there's Mars and Earth have places that almost mirror each other, and then you get the story that's been out there for a long time. The accompanying photographs of the face on Mars.
Yes.
What's the story behind the face on Mars? Is that part of? a extraterrestrial or human-made structure on Mars?
Well, we have Linda Moulton Howe in Packing for Mars talking about her experience of being ushered into some kind of uber secret hallways in a security building, shown the photographs that were actually taken of the face on Mars back in the 70s during those Viking missions. And she says what she witnessed had much more clarity than the photographs that we are shown in the public. Now, Richard Hoagland, could be credited for being the first person to really kind of push the Mars extraterrestrial civilization agenda and present evidence of it. And the face on Mars, I think, was one of those very, very early and very powerful connections that made us wonder if that was really evidence of ET. And as we now know, of course, then later missions and later photography that they took began to debunk that the face on Mars was actually what it was. They would say that it's just all mirrors and smoke and mirrors, or shadows and light, a play of shadows and light, and that pareidolia takes over the imagination, and humans like to see things that aren't there. But if you listen to Linda Moulton Howe's testimony about what she saw, then you would have to say, okay, now obviously she's delusional. Those people were trying to fool her, or there maybe really is some kind of an agenda going on with photo manipulation. And we talk about that in the film, of course, because, there has to be, if this kind of stuff is credible, there has to be evidence of photo manipulation. And there very definitively is evidence of photo manipulation that's taking place in the hallowed halls of NASA. As we've found out, even, we have Jose Escamilla, the late Jose Escamilla, the great filmmaker that created those amazing moon rising documentaries showing how the images on the moon have been tampered with. But since we released the film, and I think the day that we actually won the People's Choice Award, we were approached by Ken Johnson, who was an original NASA employee involved in developing and prototyping and beta testing a lot of the NASA and Apollo materials that were used on those missions. And at one point in his life, he was in touch with those. He was put in charge of the photographic evidence, and he found clear evidence of smudging, and he himself walked in on smudging taking place. So it's clear that this is going on. So the face on Mars is something we didn't want to focus on in the film. We like the well over 100-year-old now historical start, we think, of the actual fascination between Earth on Mars in modern history, and that was with Nikola Tesla picking up a signal of light, like a light beam that he registered coming from the surface of Mars. And he actually went to the top of Pikes Peak and began to flash back signals to try and start a communication between what he was convinced was a civilization on the surface of Mars. Now, J.J. Hertog brings it into another area altogether, which they call the Elysium Quarter, which is an area on the surface of Mars where you see distinct pyramidal shapes, which we have Credo Mutwa commenting on, which show definitively placed clear pyramids, which is a cultural phenomenon which has happened not just on Earth but also on the Moon and, of course, on Mars. So we now have this correlation between monuments that have been left behind on these bodies all around us, which are indicative of the fact that we do have some kind of a solar heritage that goes well beyond our existence in modern history, as we were told in the school books of the 20th century.
I have a question. If I may. Has there ever been any consideration that we have the story totally backwards, that we all were originally on Mars, it became uninhabitable, so we came to Earth, that we are really the Martians?
Well, that's a very good point, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with that one, Barbara, because although we don't really come out and say it, I do believe that the evidence is there to support that we are actually the descendants of the original Martians. Now, as crazy as it may sound, I mean, if you look at the time scale that's much greater, you can, and even NASA now is starting to leak out that, hey, there might have been water on Mars, and we think now they finally admitted that there's water on Mars. Now they're taking it a step further. Well, there were oceans on the surface of Mars, and definitely if you look at what the rovers are driving over and photographing, there's actually fossil evidence on the surface of Mars that show that there was more there than just dust clouds and red sand.
So could we be actually getting ready to try to return home to reignite that planet? Because somebody once said, one of the people that said they had been to Mars said that the sky was actually blue there. So I'm wondering if over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, humanity as a whole has hopscotched between the two planets, wearing one out, tiring it out, leaving it, but staying in close proximity, and then as we destroy the planet that we are inhabiting, the other one kind of comes back to life, and we transport ourselves back to that one to start the whole cycle over again.
Cycle in motion again. It could be. There's this interesting case of a Russian boy called Berishka, and I think the only interview ever done by a Western journalist was Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy. They actually flew over to talk to him and interview him, and he has these vivid memories of living on Mars and being part of a society that was very warlike. Now, the evidence of the warlike civilization on Mars, and if we look at our civilization here on Earth, I mean, what are we? We're always in war, always at war with one another all the time. Everywhere on the planet. I mean, maybe there's no world war going on right now, but there's more little wars going on. There's more money being spent now on weapon manufacture and maintenance of a war machinery on the planet than there ever has in all of history. So we're very warlike people. So and then there's John Brandenburg, who's a physicist who worked with NASA and was working on the Clementine project, and he's an astrophysicist, and he came out and he found out that there are traces in the atmosphere of xenon-128 in Mars's atmosphere that represent only one thing, because they're very unique. All the planets in our solar system have very similar consistency in terms of elements, but this one element, xenon-128, only seems to occur in one instance, and that's whenever there's been nuclear atomic detonation. And he makes a very, very solid case for the fact that what took place on Mars, and he says it probably may have happened already a million years ago. I mean, it's hard to tell with the time scales, but the fact is that the xenon-128 that they found, the atmosphere of Mars, there's only one other place in the entire solar system where that occurs, and that's in the Earth's atmosphere, and not until we began detonating atomic bombs in our atmosphere as well. So, and another thing that takes place when people test atomic bombs on Earth, a lot of times they test them in barren desert regions, and what happens is that directly below the detonation, a very strange phenomenon happens. A sheet of glass is formed, and it's a very specific glass. It's called trinitite, and this kind of trinitite glass is formed with these extreme heat radiation blasts. Well, guess what? There's another planet in our solar system that has trinitite. And guess which one that is?
Mars.
Exactly. And it's interesting that the two areas that he found the highest concentration of xenon-128 hovering in the atmosphere and also on the have on the surface trinitite are the areas where the face on Mars, that's what they call the Cydonia Plateau, and another area called Galaxia's Chaos, where both of those regions is very fascinating, because if you look at the geophysical structure of the land masses, there's even been papers done by scientists on the location and the exact positioning of certain geographical monuments, what do they say that in English? Now I'm starting to lose my English. Just like landmarks, certain landmarks that appear to be unnatural, and they began to do like measurements on those landmarks. They found a direct correlation to a message that may have been left behind by that civilization to signal a future civilization that there really was intelligent life on the surface, and this is the proof of it. Now, we've done that on Earth as well. I mean, this is something that even Gauss proposed in the 1920s when they were trying to take forested areas of Siberia and carve out certain structures so that people from the moon, which they thought there may be a civilization on back in the 20s, could actually see and recognize on the surface of the Earth that there's an intelligent species there based on those landmarks.
So is there a connection between Mars and the moon and the Earth? Is there similar structures?
Well, there's the connection that essentially you have the pyramids that appear on all these bodies, and you have there's a lot of mythological references in Earth's language. Like there's a mythological god, for example, called Marduk, and
right.
Marduk goes back. Even some people say that Marduk may be related to Enki, and back to the early days of the Egyptian mythology, and he was considered to be the ruler of Mars and Earth. And there's like a Nubian legend about a city called Meru, where there were pyramids that were built by red men. And then there's a Tibetan legend about the destruction of the land of the seven cities. And these are all embedded into the Mahabharata again, which is the Indian, sort of like the Indian Bible, if you might want to call it, for lack of better words. It's the historical record of the spiritual story of Rama, and they talk about and they talk in the New Text about the seven Rishi cities. So was the Tibetan legend about the land of seven cities related to the seven Rishi cities? And in those ancient texts, they talk about people that had flying machines, and they actually had a name for them, and they're called Vimanas. And so these Vimanas are again found in the text of the Mahabharata. They even have blueprints for Vimanas, and they have detailed descriptions of how to build them, which are levels of science magnitudes above what really should have been existing at a time back thousands and thousands of years ago, when we were apparently still using copper and trying to hammer out stones to build pyramids as slaves. I mean, it doesn't add up. There's all these ancient mythologies, and there's Sanskrit texts that describe a Vimana battle that took place on the moon. And in our film, if you've watched it, that scene where we show the Mona Lisa, which is that the Apollo, this controversial Apollo 20 mission, which apparently never took place, where in fact what happened was an archaeological exploration to try and recover what they'd found on the dark side of the moon, which was this massive spaceship which actually had surviving technology and surviving beings. In this case, it was this being they called the Mona Lisa, which were stuck in stasis, frozen in time. Were these creatures or these people that are our ancestors? Were they the ones that the Mahabharata is talking about in the Sanskrit texts? Is this, what's going on? Like even the Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, they talk about excavations in these Rishi cities where they found skeletons in the streets that were holding hands, as if some great doom just, suddenly whammed them out of the sky. And there's like clumps of glass that they found on the streets. And they've now found that these globs were actually clay pots that melted under the intense heat. So these battles that took place apparently in these that are actually documented in these historical records, they may actually be factual accounts of this ancient Martian, let's say, ancestry that we have that came to Earth, and maybe they battled what was on Earth, and maybe those people or those creatures or those ETs that were on Earth were actually reptilians. We don't know. So it's interesting because all of these things they're surfacing now, and they're still being called crazy conspiracy theories. But I know that in a matter of time, what's now being debunked or being vehemently attacked and ridiculed by scientists is one day going to be accepted as bona fide fact. When we're brave enough to accept that our historical picture is super simplified and that we've been held for stupid and dumb.
Frank, you mentioned Tesla had that observation of this little glimmer of light from Mars, what is the Vatican's observatory seeing when they put their scientists to the telescopes and doing their investigations?
Well, one of the things that we were looking to research during the course of making of Packing for Mars was scenarios which would cause an elite group to feel it necessary to set up a colony on Mars in the altruistic sense of, hey, we need to save the human genome. Because Alternative 3 talks about the three alternatives that they were trying to invent or to come up with to save the humans from what they thought was impending doom due to climate change and overpopulation back in the 40 years ago. But what would there be now in our current age that would be an indication that something cataclysmic was about to hit the Earth, which would forever alter life or wipe out civilization as we know it? And we heard a lot about Planet X, and so we were very intrigued to come across the Italian journalist Luca Scantamburlo, who actually had been directly in touch and had been given information from a whistleblower Jesuit who had been involved in the Vatican's own secret space program, in which he documents that they actually have discovered Planet X, and they actually are very, very interested in observing our skies, and they have telescope systems set up pointed from the South Pole and from the North Pole in directions, of course, that most amateur astronomers aren't able to peer into, because let's face it, most of us are located in the mid-latitudes of the globe. So we're only looking at in a certain direction into the heavens. We can't see a 360-degree view off the top of our planet or the bottom of our planet very well. And that apparently is what the Vatican is doing. And it's very interesting because, if you've probably noticed this amazing secrecy around what's happening in Antarctica. Every time someone, like like you and I couldn't just charter a plane and cruise down to the Antarctica and land and check it out. We'd be intercepted. We'd be arrested, and we'd be promptly escorted, if not fined or thrown in jail, from the continent. And you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, what is the big deal? And the big deal that we're told officially is that, it's the pristine climate. We need to preserve the pristine climate of Antarctica. We're going to pollute it. We could be bringing bacteria and blah, blah, blah there, and et cetera. They give us this altruistic thing, and they've got these research stations set up down there. It's a global, and in all areas of the world there's a conflict among nations, but only in Antarctica are we all friends. And there we're all working together to save the planet and the climate and protect the Antarctica as the last resource. But it's a little bit ridiculous to think how much trouble they actually go to keep people away from that continent. I mean, why? We even have a friend who's an extreme sport athlete who wanted to, he wanted to get a sponsor to land on the perimeter of the shore and run as an extreme sport ultra runner to the center of to the South Pole by himself. And he couldn't get any sponsors, so he got some rogue Russian pilot to agree for a lesser amount of money to, under the radar, fly him in, drop him off, and take off. And he actually managed it. And he ran and set a new world record from the edge of the ice to the center of the South Pole in 28 days single-handedly, and filmed the whole thing, took geomagnetic readings and GPS readings so he could prove where he'd been. And as soon as he showed up, they didn't celebrate his arrival. They quickly arrested him. They threatened him and with jail time. And he was greeted by CIA that were very, very upset with the fact that he took it upon himself to run, single-handed. He might have seen something after all, right? So the Vatican is down there, and the Vatican is filming. The Vatican, according to what Lucas Scantamburlo is telling us in the film, is they actually discovered this body because of the Pioneer 10 mission that happened much earlier, and specifically the Pioneer 10 mission. If you're into astronomy and rocketry, you know that based on calculations, they basically, considering the amount of emptiness in the vacuum around us, they can calculate very precisely how they're going to send a probe into space and for how long it's going to be alive and how much time they have to get information back from it before it either vanishes, disintegrates, or whatever. But in the case of Pioneer 10, they had a very anomalous thing happen. It did not go at all as they predicted. It actually veered off course, and there was no explanation for it. The only explanation for its veering off course could be the approach or the influence of another body, electrical, magnetical influence, so large that they didn't even know it was out there. And that's what set them on their own program of sending a probe into deep space. With the help of Lockheed Martin, they developed plasma-type technology already back in the late 70s and early 80s, and they sent a probe out there, and they actually followed the evidence that they discovered through Pioneer 10, and they found this planet. The planet, I guess you'd say it's Planet X or Nibiru or whatever you want to call it. And they were very, very interested in it because the Vatican, of course, wants to keep tabs on cataclysmic events that might come to Earth because they have to make it work into their, their religious dogma, into their doctrines to be able to, not lose their following to some approaching body where everyone loses faith. So they were very, very interested in what happens. And they were the ones that actually discover Planet X and photograph it. And we show pictures of that body that they found and photographed in Packing for Mars.
Frank, for this movie, you have so many commentators that our listeners have heard on multiple networks. Barbara may have had some of them as guests. I've spoken to a few of the commentators as well, but you have very many well-known people presenting their perspectives on the subject. You're going all around the world filming as well. Packing for Mars isn't just like someone just sitting in an ivory tower making their hypothesis known. You're interacting with a wide variety of people. Can you tell us about what it's like working with so many people from various backgrounds? What are their observations contributing to what you're trying to do in Packing for Mars?
Well, a lot of it is it's just following a thread, like following the dots, connecting the dots. Mm-hmm. And so when you make a film like this, I was not an expert on Mars in any sense. I'm not an astrophysicist or an academic, but it was interesting. I mean, I'm interested in those subjects, and I consider myself to be fairly well informed in terms of the state of the art of certain areas of science, let's say. And so I think, you need kind of a foundation of healthy optimism and healthy skepticism, sort of a bit of both. And balance. Yeah, a balance. Because one of the things that really irritated us in a lot of films is, like, documentary type films tend to get a protagonist and then they get, or a couple of them, and then they get a couple of people to gang up on them. So they get them to tell their story, and then someone comes along, smart ass, and tries to debunk it. And we didn't really want to make that kind of a film. This was kind of a film that would explore the hypothesis from the perspective of various people without pitting them against each other, without telling one another. We didn't really share the who we were filming next with all of the protagonists, because in some cases, as we found in the UFO community, there's a lot of rivalry going on, and there's a lot of antagonism going on, and neither Tanya Maidenford or myself are really in that club. Like we don't consider ourselves like hardcore ufologists or what bent on proving some theory, but we are definitely interested in UFOs and ufology. And Tanya Maidenford has made quite some of the landmark films with Jose Escamilla on UFOs and NASA and the moon and stuff like that. So it's more about kind of allowing each person to express their experience. And then later, when you're in the editing floor, you don't go out blindly. Of course, you've got your questions and you're interested, and you need to know a little bit about each person that you go to interview, because you want to be able to help them release what is in some case, really hidden or buried information that they don't feel comfortable sharing with a lot of people. So it's about really, like, we're all brothers and sisters in the world, so there's no reason for anybody to feel like you're coming there to suck information or energy from them so that you can manipulate it in the future. It's about finding the nuggets and what they have. And even though many of the people in the film don't necessarily know each other or necessarily like each other in some cases, or maybe they liked each other for a while and now they hate each other and now they like each other again, it's constantly fluctuating. But what's interesting is, regardless of how different they are and whether or not they like each other, it's amazing how much they harmonize together as a team to represent this picture that we put together, this picture where you're looking at it, although we don't bat you over the head and say, this is what's going on and you must believe this, we never really want to go that way. We do present the evidence as we found it, and we tie together some of those strings and let you, the viewer, kind of figure out whether it resonates with you or not, because a lot of these things they're going back to, in some cases, like Duncan of Finian was involved in MK Ultra, and he was, if you know anything about MK Ultra, and Miranda Kelly, she was in the two of them, they were like an MK Ultra, if you could call it, they hate it when I use this term super soldier, because they've broken out of the thing now and they're working their way through the information of what they're uncovering in deep, buried or suppressed or violently buried information in them about what they were involved in. So they don't like to really call it super soldier, but that's the popular Hollywood term, super soldier, meaning an enhanced or a soldier working for the military with enhancements. Some of them are physical enhancements, some of them are mental enhancements. In the case of Duncan and Miranda, they dig up some very, very profound experiences and memories that they had being in this MK Ultra program, which was very diverse. And in their particular case, it had to do with being on missions that led Duncan to pilot aircraft and spaceships to Mars. And he never told anybody about that until, thanks to Tanya Maidenford, who got to know him earlier. Because of the trust in the relationship, he was willing to talk about that information with us on camera. So it's very important for us as documentarians not to judge that information, but just to kind of pull that information together and present it as professionally and tastefully as possible, so that we can put it up against what someone like Andrew Basiago, who was one of the first people that I wanted to go see, was talking about. Because Andrew Basiago was also one of the early people that talked about Mars experiences, which do not correlate to anything we were learning in NASA or science or anything around us. Did you want to say something, Barbara?
It feels very much like this film. It feels like you are seeding the consciousness of humanity for the potential that the destiny of mankind has before it. So you've scattered the seeds, and it'll hit everybody differently, but you planted something in the consciousness of anybody that sees this film of the potential and perhaps the memories of what they have inside of them that they haven't gotten to the point of remembering yet.
Absolutely. That's what's going on. We're even being approached by people afterward that are, they're saying, look, you've touched a nerve. I mean, one guy was like, he worked as a consultant for the U.S. Patent Office, and he said, like, you've hit a nerve with me because I've been talking to my own off-the-record whistleblower who has invented things and been involved in a program developing technology to support the bases that were built for the Mars settlement, which has been there as back as the 1970s. And so it's like these kind of people. The nice thing about making a film like this is that you sort of unlock certain things, and people approached us after we made the film and gave us even more tantalizing bits of information that support what we're talking about. Even what's happening with the whole Corey Goode and Jordan Sather and all this whole new wave of millennials that are pushing for disclosure. It's great because what they're putting out in their films is only further supporting what we dove into when we started making this film. Actually, when you look back, we started making this film in 2010, so we're going back almost like 9 years now. That we started making the film, and 9 years ago there was very, very little information going on about this premise, about this. I mean, there was the disclosure movement, but it had more or less been kept under wraps. I mean, Stephen Bassett and Stephen Greer were pushing for disclosure in 2001, but it pretty much like vanished because nobody was talking about it. So there's a new wave of stuff coming out now, which is refreshing let's just say the curiosity of society. My only fear is that, some of the powers that be, let's say, these elitists, these globalists, are trying to stem the tide, and they're doing whatever they can to control the spin. So one thing we always have to be careful about is that the information that's coming out, some of it can be very, very sensationalized. And much of it, of course, is not substantiated. So we have to use our own BS filters, our discernment, to be able to find out how much of this information resonates with me, how much of this information actually might have a basis in factual evidence that I can find, and how much of it is just, the whistleblowers that have emerged from these programs with nothing but the shirt on their backs, that have no evidence to prove, but are telling their story because they need to get the story out there, and so we can compare notes between whistleblowers to see where the overlaps are.
Okay, and Frank, what science would need to be taken to Mars to make the colonization work, like building an energy plant, or would there be solar power, wind power? Obviously, water wouldn't work. Now, but how what would be the like to have some kind of energy plants up and running to make this happen?
I believe that a lot of the activity that's taking place on Mars now is underground. Oh. And from what and from what whistleblowers have come to us talking about, they're talking about underground. They're talking about settlements that are built along the walls of ancient volcanic tunnels under the surface of the planet. So obviously the surface of the planet has been scarred. The surface of the planet has gone through cataclysmic, some cataclysm that basically made it, let's say, maybe not totally uninhabitable, but we can't compare it to what we have on Earth, obviously. Now, there might be beings on the surface that are adapted. I mean, it's amazing how creatures can adapt. Even we have creatures, in the depths of our oceans, which we know very little about, that can live without oxygen, without light, without warmth, for millions of years, and survive. We're only just now discovering those creatures, so there could very well be lots of creatures, let's say, or animals or wildlife on the surface of Mars. And I think Andrew Basiago was earnestly trying to push a lot of evidence out there in terms of what there might be now on the surface in terms of these animals. And his own experiences on the surface describe some kind of creatures that that are actually predatory on the surface of Mars. But from our understanding, I think most of the activity now taking place is under the surface, and there's a large body of evidence also to support that there's an under the surface of Earth colony or civilization as well. Now, whether that means the Earth is hollow or not, I'm not sure. This is something that we're definitely very interested in. There's a lot of theories about the hollow Earth, but I think probably the most realistic or the most viable to me at the moment is that there's not necessarily a hollow Earth with the sun in the center, but that there's these giant caverns, humongous caverns that are city-sized, metropolis-sized, that actually support millions of people that do exist. And there's traces of evidence of those really existing. And if we're to take the diaries of this German author seriously about his experiences, now he's amassed 6 books on it, and it's like you can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just pretty crazy about these inner Earth civilizations. So for me, it's no far stretch to think that there's an inner Earth civilization on the surface on Mars as well. The technology that they use, I mean, we're not talking about the kind of technology that we're used to here on Earth. We think that we need oil, we need to burn carbon and fossil fuels to generate an electricity, or we need to burn nuclear rods or uranium, refined uranium. We need solar or wind, blah, blah, blah. None of these things are a long-term solution. And any advanced civilization, if we're to believe that they do exist and have been visiting Earth, they're not using those technologies. They're using technologies that are much more centered around, dark matter perhaps, or magnetics, or they're dealing with, on a subatomic level, harnessing the power of things that we just don't understand in our physics. Our laws of physics aren't willing to go there. We're just, we're still grappling with quantum physics. But fact is, most of these sciences that they're working with are off the books, and they're not being discussed in the science and the universities that people are going to school in the mainstream, in the, let's say, surface world, if you want to call it that, of Earth.
If there are caves in the hollow Earth, maybe Barbara can move there to get away from the bears. Yeah. but you do bring up a interesting point with the if Mars has the hollow the hollow Mars theory, you do cover that in your what you're talking about with your documentary with Dr. Michael Sala, where something seems to be going on in Antarctica. The Argatha concept. It's just, earlier in the show, we spoke a little bit about the connection between Mars and Earth and with the structures, but now we have almost like the same exterior and interior of the planets. I just thought that was interesting.
Well, it makes sense to me because we're finding the structures of the monuments, the Sphinx or the face or the pyramids and the Elysium Quadrant. It's like these things are all evidence on the surface of a culture which seem to correlate to the cultures on both planets. So if we have an inner Earth, then we have a civilization on the inner Earth. And there's a lot of people, and Bill Tompkins was one of the people saying that the moon is hollow. And when the NASA program, when the Apollo program was taking place, they ran experiments where they hurled the lunar module back onto the surface to see what would happen if it collided on the surface. And what they found was shocking. They actually found when they collided, their lunar module into the surface of the moon that there was a bell sound ringing for over an hour that they registered. So that could only be happening if one thing was true, and that would be that the moon might actually be hollow.
Yeah, and heard that word. The asteroid craters are all the same depth. They only go down so. It's a uniform pattern that they only go down so far. So it just seems like there might be a little bit more evidence there that the moon is hollow. They're just the asteroids are making an impact to the exterior, but there's just something that just keeps it from going any deeper.
Right. So, I mean, the thing is, the moon is a weird thing because the moon shouldn't really be that close to the Earth. It's too big for a body that size to be that close to the Earth without colliding into it. Wouldn't make sense if it was a solid body. There's like all these different points about the moon that you could list off of why it just doesn't make any sense for it to be there. For example, it's got a perfectly round orbit, and no bodies that are anywhere else in the known solar system do planets that catch bodies like asteroids that turn into moons have anything but an elliptical orbit, because basically it's an uneven orbit because it's impossible for this orbit to be perfectly round. And so it's and the moon always faces the same side to the Earth. So it's just there's things like this that you have to ask yourself, what's that all about? And there's legends that talk about the moon. We were talking about Tiwanaku before in Bolivia, and they talk about a time there was a civilization that existed there 12,000 years ago, estimated, and they basically left symbols on the wall of the Kalasaya temple that say essentially talk about a time before the moon, and their calendar was the first time it was actually decoded wasn't until the 1950s, and in the calendar they talk about a time where there first was a smaller moon that circled around the Earth, and then around 11,000 to 13,000 years ago the big moon came, the one that we know now, and their calendar even describes a solar year where there was a record amount of lunar eclipses, which could only take place if there was more than one moon circling the Earth. So yeah, and then there's it goes further, right? There's a Zulu tribe which believes that the moon is hollow, and they have a legend that talks about two brothers that came to Earth and brought the moon with them, called Wawani and Mapanku, and these two beings had skin like fish. They had scales on their skin. And it's interesting because, as you know, we also worked with Klaus Donna on the Klaus Donna Chronicles that talks about artifacts around the world that are found that don't make any sense in terms of, they're called out-of-place artifacts because they don't fit the modern archaeological orthodoxy of what history is all about. And one of those artifacts that Klaus shows in the Chronicles, it's like a being that looks like it has scaly skin, a huge creature, like a giant sitting on the back of an elephant, riding an elephant. And these are dated back around that time and there's another interesting story in their story, the Zulu story that is very similar to the story that comes out of Mesopotamia and the Sumerians, where they talk about two brothers, Enlil and Enki, that basically were these two brothers that came to Earth. And the whole thing about the fish skin, you can see it in Babylonian pictures. There's remnants of fish-like beings or fish-like cloaks that they're wearing. And you can even actually find pictures of the Pope now, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church, where the Pope is wearing a cap. And if you look at that cap very closely, it's actually not a cap. It's the head of a fish with scales and its mouth open. I mean, it's interesting. We met another filmmaker in Bavaria who turned us on to a Bolivian and a Spanish artist who went to Bolivia on vacation, and he was sitting around bored, and he went for a stroll in the backwoods, wanted to do some painting, and this UFO lands. And the UFO, this like window-like thing opens, and he sees these two people standing there looking at him. And they look like fish. Two fish people staring at him. And he, ever since that event, he's become obsessed with painting them. He was this world-famous artist out of Spain, like totally, well-known, totally conservative, and suddenly he has this experience in Bolivia, and he comes back and he does nothing else now except paint these fish people and make sculpture of these fish people on the UFO that he saw.
Okay. Well, there's another animal to add to our animal imagery for today's show. But there's
right.
That's a nice lead-in for to plug Laird Scranton being on Barbara's Monday show next month, and he has a book on the Dogon tribe and the fish people and the Robert Temple's book, The Serious Mystery or something like that, has references to the fish gods appearing to the Dogon people.
Right.
So that's just like one of these patterns. They were very much aware of in like long before telescopes were invented, that there were
right.
moons circling
yes.
some planet. It's like, well,
yes.
how'd they know that?
They knew, exactly. They knew the orbits of these moons, of these planets, which are we hadn't even invented telescopes yet. Yeah, it's very interesting. We have a Dogon initiate in the film too, Bikbai, and he talks about he talks about something else. I mean, I got into a very interesting discussion with him about why when people are confronted with evidence to the contrary of what they know, proving that reality is much deeper and broader, and that the picture of reality they have is smaller, and that what they've been taught isn't necessarily true, when they're confronted with new facts, why do they still stick to the past? Why do they not break free of the chains of the limited thinking? And he talks about a word that the Dogon have for that called Zenimti. Remember that part of the film?
Mm-hmm.
And Zenimti basically is when people, he describes it in terms of an analogy of someone who's sitting in the mud, and you walk by them and you say, hey, dude, you're sitting in the mud. You ought to get up out of the mud. Let me help you. And not only would the person not get up out of the mud or want to be helped getting out of the mud, they'll come up with reasons why they need to stay sitting in the mud. And
mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting analogy to how people in society are that are not willing to go down the rabbit hole and look at this kind of information that we're presenting in Packing for Mars, or that we're presenting in the Klaus Donner Chronicles. I think it challenges people's worldview so much that because they're used to, people are creatures of stability. That society is it's a thing of habit. We want things to be stable. We want things to be predictable. And quite honestly, let's face it, most people aren't cut out for conspiracy theories and following the road down the rabbit hole to see where this all leads. I think we're not really made for this kind of stuff. But why has it emerged? Well, it's emerged because people are taking a look at society now and what's going on in the world, and they're really worried. Maybe a lot of them are worried about where this is all headed. In fact, I think most people that are still unconscious, their form of expressing it is just discontent and feeling that something's not quite right. They don't know how to explain what it is. It's like Richard Dolan talks about. He says, there's this need to know the truth. People feel it when it's something is just not right. And if we're looking at the world picture now, it's actually really crazy what's going on in the world right now. And I think in just in the last 6 months to a year, we've come across even more reason to really consider, why is there a breakaway civilization, and why would there be a colony on Mars? Like, what for? Why not just stay here? We've got it much nicer on Earth. We don't need Mars. We probably got things on Earth we haven't found that we could still explore, et cetera, et cetera. Or, why don't we solve our problems here on Earth first before we go to another planet and screw it up there? So, and now if you're looking at, the people are just feeling this stuff is going on. And what's happening right now, what are the three, I'd say the three pivotal issues facing us now, which might cause a breakaway civilization to have justification, or to justify their need to have a colony on Mars, which we didn't have a chance to explore in Packing for Mars yet. We only touch upon them a little bit, are now beginning to bloom or come, let's just say, poke their heads out of the soil, if we're looking at the analogy of plants, and that is artificial intelligence and the implications on society. The next thing that's coming is called smart meters. And if you've done any research on smart meters, basically what smart meters are is your utility company participating in a government-sponsored cash grab to convert all of the analog electrical meters into corresponding digital electric meters, all under the premise of global warming. That, my God, we're causing greenhouse gas. We have to cut down on our energy resources. We have to be smarter with how we use our energy. And instead of admitting that we have these amazing technologies that we could use to revolutionize the world, and, we don't need oil anymore. We don't need to burn any fossil fuels. We don't need any nuclear. We don't need any of this stuff. We could be harnessing this completely different form of energy that's pollution-free. No, what are we told? We, the population, have to tighten our buckles, and we have to, buckle up, and we have to face the hard times of, reducing our use of carbon in the world. And one of those things is using smart meters. And the smart meters are there to make the whole communication of all the electrical devices in all the houses analytically, studied, so that they can say, well, this person's using this much and this person shouldn't be doing that. And it's a total invasion of our privacy, and it works hand in hand with the third element that's coming at us, and that's 5G. And all of these things have been proven to be so damaging to the subtle organized energy field of the human body. The biological makeup of a human body is not just physical, like blood cells, but it's electrical. We are electrical beings. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of evidence now coming out that we're actually reining our bodies into existence through this subtle organized energy field, and that our physical bodies are the end result of this consciousness, which is reigning into physical reality, our bodies and our thoughts and our ideas and our actions. Now, these new technologies like smart meters are causing dirty electricity, polluting the environment. Tests are showing that they totally disrupt our cellular structure. They damage our DNA. The 5G thing is coming in on a microwave level that's never happened before. It's being pushed without any kind of public scrutiny. We're being told it's the next greatest, coolest thing. The new generation of kids playing games and watching movies and hearing endless music on their iPhones want it because it's better, it's faster, it's quicker. All of it is in the, you have to ask yourself, why? Because somehow we survived with all of this before. Why now suddenly this incredible push to have this technology pushed on us earthlings when it's obviously causing people to get cancer, causing people to have brain tumors, causing people to get sick? Where's this leading? Well, it goes back to that Georgia Guidestones analogy that I brought up earlier in our show. Mm-hmm. Is there really an agenda to depopulate the earth? And is this really not just a clever way to slyly, underhandedly bring in technology that actually facilitates the goal of someone that wants to do this? And what would, because this energy and this technology is so all penetrating, there will be no place to hide unless you want to climb into a mountain cave and live in a cave for the next 10 years. So you have to ask yourself, in terms of alternative 3 and the premise of packing for Mars, of setting up a Mars colony. Well, I mean, first thing people often say to me is, well, if the elitists are really behind this, well, why would they do it? Because they're going to be killing themselves as well. Well, maybe not. Maybe the elite do have the escape hatch, and maybe the escape hatch is a colony on the moon or the inside of the moon or a colony on the inside of Mars.
That makes sense. And so, what's the role of those of us who are left behind just to serve the whims of the elite family? If some of them stay here on Earth, and the main parts of the family go to Mars?
Well, I think it's, let's say that scenario I just painted is actually true or viable. Mm-hmm. They would be, they may already be on Mars waiting it out. And what's here is not necessarily them, but, to take it a bit further here, maybe this is going to freak out some of your viewers, but there's a lot of evidence that there's actually cloning taking place, and that what we have here on Earth left behind to rule or regulate or impose the agenda are really just the avatar clones of the elitists who are safely tucked away outside of the influence of the pollutants that they've set in motion here on the planet Earth.
And as you talk about that, you got the frack trucks driving by the front of my house.
There you go.
Okay, so you were talking about the cognitive dissonance
right.
people have when they're confronted. Their preconceived notions are confronted with facts. The Georgia Guidestones are, just one really good example of.
Yeah, or the Denver airport.
Yeah, just that there is an elite group of people who are determined to depopulate the planet, and those who survive are going to be slaves. Just history is just going to repeat itself. But we also had on last Monday's show, Barbara and Greg Little had a great discussion about Atlantis. It was just a captivating discussion, and Klaus covers that topic as well. Where do you think it was located? What was going on there? Just according to some of Greg's research, it sound like there's an elite group of people living on either the spaceship that crash landed in the Atlantic, or there's just kind of looking at this theme of elites that have always been present on Earth.
Well, it seems like Antarctica was not necessarily always located in the latitude that it's at now. That there actually is times where the Earth not just had a magnetic pole shift, but actually had a physical shift in the poles. And, I mean, there's lots of cases where this happens, and it's quite conceivable that it's happened on Earth as well. It stretches probably back to, Sala talks about it in terms of Corey Goode, and that's 60,000 years ago. Who's to put a number on it? It's hard to say, but I think it's conceivable that Antarctica was located somewhere completely differently. And the CIA in 1984 began doing remote viewing on the surface of Mars, and some of that information was released recently, and we found it, and Michael had it in his presentation that we filmed as well, which you can see, by the way, on our Real House channel. And that information talks about remote viewers connecting with some civilization on the planet of Mars about 1 million years ago. And they were describing an urgent situation of having to get off the surface of the planet to survive. And they talked about the solution being the destination where they were going being a place that was volcanic and tropical, and it described very much what actually the surface of Antarctica is like. Now, Antarctica at present is buried under a mile of ice, but underneath that ice, there is definitely volcanic activity. There's definitely geysers and thermal activity taking place. Mm-hmm. So what they're describing in this remote viewing done by the CIA confirms that it's possible that the CIA was interested in this ancient Mars civilization, because obviously what they found on the surface of Mars, which they didn't tell us about, archaeologically caused them to be ever since obsessed with the history of the planet and Mars. And this would lead us to believe that Antarctica may have actually been settled by these Martians who fled from Mars to escape some fate. Maybe it was war, maybe it was Planet X, It may have been something else. Like we have Jerry Wills talking about it in Packing for Mars in terms of Planet X making a routine passage through our solar system, so its perihelion, which is the closest it comes to our sun, actually affecting certain planets in the way it times itself through the solar system. Now, maybe 12 or so thousand years ago, it came through our solar system, and maybe planet Mars was inhabited, and maybe it was 12,000 years ago, for all we know. But it basically may have wiped out the surface of the planet then, just much as like a massive meteorite would affect Earth's planet. But let's say these Martians came to Earth. What's interesting is you can find in the legends, they talk about these things, that in the Greek legends they talk about it. They talk about in the Bible, they talk about in Enoch, how the fallen angels came here, the sons of heaven, and they mated with the wives of men or the children of men, and they spread all out over the planet. And if you look at what's happening in Teotihuacan, where we show the alignment of the pyramid of the sun, the pyramid of the moon, and the pyramid of Kukulkan, which represents Marduk actually, which is Mars, and the whole plaza is set up like a giant gateway that leads from the mini Kukulkan planet along a huge walkway up to the pyramid of the moon, which is actually the second largest pyramid. If you lay the orbital pathways of the planets in our solar system over that plaza in Teotihuacan, placing the sun in the position of the sun pyramid of Teotihuacan, only two orbits line up with the positioning of those other two pyramids. The pyramid of the moon lines up with the Earth's orbit, and the Kukulkan Marduk pyramid lines up with the orbit of Mars. So there's evidence right there that ancient civilization somehow managed to figure out exactly the positioning of the planets orbiting our solar system to place the positions of their pyramids in those places, almost as if symbolically to say the journey of our ancestors came from Mars to the Earth, because the road leads from the Kukulkan pyramid to the moon pyramid, which some people would say maybe should be renamed to be called the Pyramid of the Earth. Even the relation of the size of those pyramids is interesting. If you look at the relation of the pyramid of the moon to the relation of the pyramid of Kukulkan, you come up with a ratio of 0.562 or 526. And that ratio correlates to one other interesting ratio in our solar system. Guess what that might be? If you look at the diameter of the Earth and you compare it to the diameter of Mars, it's the exact same 0.526.
Wow. So, there is a connection.
So there's a connection. So did they come to Antarctica and from Antarctica spread their seed, so to speak? over and dominated the rest of the planet. There's even evidence that Atlantis may have been Antarctica. There's a lot of evidence about ancient Atlantis actually was Antarctica. Now, I believe that Atlantis speaks of what a period, an epoch on Earth where maybe Atlantis wasn't just in one location, but that it had several central places. But it's conceivable to me that Antarctica was indeed a very large continent settled by very advanced civilization way back then, and that the civilization of people that lived there had white skin, just like, you know, the Caucasians we know in Western civilization. And there's really strange evidence of this white-skinned Caucasian appearing in the strangest places of the Earth, where it really has no business being in the middle of places where there's really just other total different racial genetics going on. So, I mean, there's lots of evidence to support that this implant of this civilization took place on a global scale, even had their own global language, as Klaus Dana talks about in the Chronicles, in terms of finding artifacts on stones in South America that have writing on them, which corresponds with the writing found on stones in Africa and in Japan.
Oh, that's amazing information. And how does the Perry Reese map fit in with all this ancient writing that you just mentioned, and Antarctica maybe being tropical at one point?
Right, exactly. Well, the Perry Reese map is you know, it's funny because the Perry Reese map is actually a copy, which some people believe was copied from far more ancient maps that existed. And what's interesting is that there was a time when the navigators of the Spanish fleet had access to maps which depicted continental bodies which had not yet been discovered, down to 1/60th of a meter, which is equivalent to today's road maps in accuracy. And so, I mean, where did they come up with these maps, right? They didn't obviously draw these maps. They haven't even invented longitude at that point for them to be able to accurately depict the placement of continental bodies which had not yet been discovered. This is in the 14th century, okay? Like the 14th century. Mm-hmm. So how do they know that there was a shoreline which correlates to the shoreline of Antarctica off the tip of South America back in the 1400s? It just blows your mind, and it's just very interesting to think that these events and these situations on the planet took place, and we have no knowledge about it, and it's just completely ridiculed in our world today.
Yeah, it can be ridiculed, but the Perry Reese map does seem like it's an accurate description of the shoreline, the geography, topography of Antarctica. I don't, there's the cognitive dissonance appearing again with many people, but here's this map from 700 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it's just a fascinating subject. And,
well, it just shows you, your listeners, that there's a lot more to history than is taught in the history books.
Right. And Barbara's going to be covering that Monday with
Primo.
Michael Cremo. We're winding down to like maybe 15 minutes left or so, but as we do look at some of these unexplained events. In your Antarctica movie, you're also covering Admiral Byrd's expedition. What was going on there? That still remains very secretive.
Definitely very secretive.
What did Dr. Michael Salla have to say about that?
Well, he basically talks about a fleet going down to Antarctica, a mission to essentially rout out the breakaway faction of Nazis that he claims, or that I guess the people that are part of that whole scenario of how the Nazis, basically connected with reptilians, and they went down to Antarctica, and the U.S. Navy sent down 5,000 troops, an aircraft carrier, and tanks, and whatever battalions, and they went down there to rout them out of of their base, and it's just, I know it's, for me, from what I've found now living in Germany and going to research some of this material, maybe with some material that's a little bit more firsthand or closer to it than some of the material that Salla or that some of the others are putting out there about this connection with World War II and Germany. But I'm not sure that their theories are really correct. And the thing about Byrd's expedition, there's a paper that was created by Colin Summerhays. It was a Cambridge research paper called Hitler's Antarctic Base: The Myth and Reality. And if you read that paper, it becomes clear that the Admiral Byrd mission down to Antarctica was not necessarily what Salla and people are saying it was. And I think that their paper is pretty credible, but it doesn't necessarily debunk the idea that the Germans discovered something in Antarctica which led them to be able to lead them to kind of an inner Earth, or let's just say another advanced civilization which had settled there or was still settled there. I think I'm not quite sure I'm ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. I do believe that there's a faction of Germans that broke away. I do not necessarily believe in fact, I definitely don't believe in the idea that the Germans were allied with some evil reptilian race that wanted world domination, because history is now proving itself to be totally different. In fact, what happened is that the same faction which is striving for world domination invaded Germany in the Second World War and crushed probably the last movement to try and, throw out bankers and a world hegemony, which could not be, because it would stand in the way of their plan to dominate the planet. And that's exactly what has happened before the World Wars and since the Second World War. So what may have happened is that there may be a faction of Germans that saved their bacon by going into the inner Earth, and they found portals into the inner Earth in Antarctica. But they didn't just find them in Antarctica. They found them in other places around the world as well. And that's been documented in some very cleverly written fictional novels, just as much as the Alternative 3 is a so-called fictional factual novel. There's also some novels that were written by first-hand experiencers during the Second World War that describe a totally different scenario that was taking place here in the final days of the Second World War. And I do think that it's quite conceivable that a substantial amount of Germans made it into some kind of a inner Earth haven. And there is definitely some very questionable experiences that Admiral Byrd talks about, which weren't necessarily during that particular expedition to Antarctica, but may have taken place at other times. And he describes his having encountered during his own research of the Antarctic continent, and in terms of photographing it and going over it and looking at it from the air, he describes a very peculiar experience of being disoriented, losing control of the airplane, and being escorted by some race of people that brought him into some interior cavern in this area, and they brought him out and they discussed things about the planet with him, and they had an uncanny German accent when they talked to him. So I think that there's something to the bird story, but I'm not sure. I think maybe the story about this fleet that went down to Antarctica and was basically ransacked by advanced UFOs that popped up out of the water and took their fleet down. I think it might be a smokescreen, but it's cool. I mean, there's a lot of people that are upset with me for saying that, probably, and because they found all kinds of evidence that the Nazis connected with the reptilians in Tibet and blah blah blah. But I'm not willing to completely abandon this theory quite yet and just join the fold and go along with this version of history that they're proclaiming, because I'm learning other aspects of the Second World War and history in Germany that are true, which are now coming out, which completely contradict the story told by the victors of the Second World War of what took place. And those people promoting the reptilian agenda, for large portions of their story are based on the fictional history part, the fake history, if you want to call it, that I'm now basically learning to debunk based on factual evidence and not just hearsay.
Okay. So for those who need to awaken to all this kind of information, and might get a sample of it at a little bit of time that's left at the Serpent Mound Seed Blessing as well. In another one of your movies, you talk about the geomagnetic storms that can affect brains and awaken people.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your movie Solar Revolution.
Yeah, in Solar Revolution, we work with the German biophysicist Dieter Breurs to explore the science behind how cosmic activity taking place and being registered and documented and measured by NASA and other astrophysicists around the world now, based on cosmic radio waves, plasma, and X-rays coming at us at unprecedented levels, is working to stimulate the human brain, and in particular the pineal gland, which is responsible in the human body for creating some of the most potent hallucinogenics, like serotonin, which help us in dreams, and one in particular called dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which induces people to have trance-like out-of-body experiences in which they encounter beings that apparently exist outside on another level, another dimension of reality that DMT helps humans break out of and encounter these beings with. And it's happening to us all over. Like, the people around the planet now that are more sensitive are the first ones to being affected, are starting to feel and see things and hear things and feel this sort of evolutionary leap coming to humanity, because it's been shown in history that humanity has these cycles where there's certain, it's always related to solar activity. And the film explores just how this current wave of solar activity that's happening, even in the case of where there's very little sunspots on the surface of the sun, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no solar activity happening whatsoever. It actually does play a very significant role in how the sun changes its relationship to Earth. And if we look at the sun and the Earth and all of us living together as one holistic system, we're all connected. And historically, it can be shown, and we show it in Solar Revolution, how evolutionary leaps in human consciousness always correspond with solar cycles. And right now, the solar cycle that we're going through is directly having a role on how these radiations coming to us from the center of the galaxy in a place called Sagittarius A, which some people call it a black hole. Other people dispute that there's black holes, but it's undisputable that there's a vortex of energy happening there right now. And this vortex of energy is shooting an unprecedented level of these cosmic particles and radiations and radio waves at our brain, at our bodies right now. And the fact that the Earth's magnetic fields are weakening, which is documented, means that more of these particles are getting through than probably have in many, many, many years or decades or even centuries. And this is having the effect on us to actually stimulate our pineal glands, and it might be the trigger effect that we need to have the next great evolutionary leap in consciousness that we kind of, you could say, need at this point. If we look at what we talked about earlier, that we're this warring civilization, and we need to make the next evolutionary leap to a higher form of consciousness so that we aren't raping our environment and, bombing ourselves into the ground and constantly caught up in political and mayhem and all the stuff that's going all around us. Maybe we really do need this evolutionary shift, and maybe as this organism and the holistic view that all of it is connected, and even the Mayas talk about, maybe right now we're at the cusp of that big leap, and this event that's taking place, this cosmic radiation that's coming at us, is the trigger for that to happen. That's what that film's about.
Okay, I just wonder if the chemtrails are being used to, possibly reverse, the effectiveness of this, how the sun and the geomagnetic, waves affect us, and
it might play a role. It might.
Yeah.
But I do believe that some of these rays, they pass through everything. They can't be stopped by even chemtrails. It's like, it's like radio waves. They go through, a certain, amount of obstacles, and chemtrails may not be enough. I mean, there's just, there's an over-exaggeration a lot of times of the impact that human-made technology can really have on us. I just was reading an interesting paper by a German researcher that said that, don't necessarily know if I agree with him, but he said that basically HAARP has about as much ability to affect our stratosphere and ionosphere through man-made, beaming of energy as about maybe 0.00001% of what's coming at us from the sun and the solar radiation in the cosmos. So, take it all in perspective, but it all adds up, I guess. And there definitely is manipulation going on of the climate. There definitely is an attempt, let's say, to manipulate the climate by certain factions of people, and chemtrails and all these things added together. I think worse is the smart meters and the 5G that's coming, and AI. I think that could have far more of a tidal wave effect on consciousness and human civilization than atmospheric disturbances probably will ever have in the next 10 years. So I think we need to all wake up collectively and begin studying this information and begin talking to each other. One of the things that we've forgotten to do really is to get together and meet and talk about these things. We're all like virtual now. We're all
right.
like, Facebooking, and Facebook is the greatest censoring control module ever invented. People think that it's great to be able to communicate on Facebook, and it is. I got to admit, I've made connections with some old friends that I never would have found without Facebook. But as soon as if I were to start getting very political with my viewpoints, and if I wanted to start a political revolution or a movement on Facebook, I'd be shut down in a second. I know a person in the area here that was just arrested for making the wrong comment in Germany because they said something bad, and they just check-marked something or smiled. They liked something, and they were picked up. So it's the perfect spy mechanism for society. So we have to get away from Facebook, and we have to get back together, watch films, talk about them, compare notes, and get together and just have this spirit of the collective human mind, rather than leaning too much on this harmful electronic technology around us.
Speaking of getting together to watch films, we're down to about 5 minutes left. How do view your films, we need to give you some time to plug your website and any other contact information, all the names of your films.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think we're very excited about is we've just been nominated for the New York International Paranormal Film Festival, which is taking place on June 6th, 7th, and 8th. So I think it's going to be pretty cool to be. Actually, it's our New York premiere in New York, and we're looking forward to having the film there. So people who want to see Packing for Mars on a screen, and that are in New York that might be listening right now, should definitely check out that film festival. That's going to be very cool. We also, if they can't wait, or they want to download it, or they want to buy the DVD, we have a website for the film, which is packingformarsmovie.com, and on that you can get copies of the DVD. You can get direct links to stream the film online, and you can also get the film in both English, and we also made a German dub. So if there's any German listeners out there who want the film in their native language, we went to the trouble of completely dubbing the entire film into Germany. So that's where you get that. But we also have, like you said, films about ancient archaeology, forbidden archaeology, or out-of-place artifacts. We produced the one and only ever DVD with Klaus Dana called the Klaus Dana Chronicles. We have that available on our website, which is klausdanachronicles.com, and Klaus with K. Maybe you can put that in the links below. And for those people who are interested in the solar activity and how it affects human consciousness, we also have another award-winning documentary which we put out just before we released Packing for Mars. It's called Solar Revolution, and we have a website for that as well, which is solar-revolution-movie.com. And that website will also allow you to stream or buy a DVD in both German. We also have that one available in French. We also have that obviously in English. So it's available in 3 languages, and you can get all of that stuff on that website. And our website, screenaddiction.com, which is Tanya Maidenford's, my production partner Tanya Maidenford's website, which is links to pretty much all the stuff we have, including the one-day Las Vegas workshop on Antarctica and the Secret Space Program, which we did with Michael Sala. You can get that at screenaddiction.com. And what else? I guess that's pretty much it. We're working on some exciting new things right now, and we'll have probably some new announcements to make soon.
Okay. Let us know, and we'll be glad to have you return. This was just a terrific afternoon spent with you, Frank, and I hope the audience really enjoyed the wealth of great information you presented.
I hope so too.
Yeah. So, Barbara, do you have any? We're down to 2 minutes, barely. Barbara, do you want to wrap up anything? Present your
just that I've seen
conclusions?
the Klaus Dana Chronicles, and matter of fact, I have a copy of it, and it's fabulous. It really is. It's something everybody should check out, because when you look at these articles, a lot of them have come through time totally intact, with amazing qualities connected to them that there is no explanation to. So learning what we don't know about is far more fun than learning what we think we already know. But that said,
I like to think of our films as the antidote to the dumbing down of society.
Yes.
That's a good way to look
at
it. Our
educational system is absolutely dumbing down our children. So when you put this kind of information out there, it's amazing, and it's fabulous. And I can't thank you enough for being here with us today. This has been such a profound show, and it will be up on YouTube shortly. Mark, back to you.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. We'll see everyone Monday.
It's definitely time to say goodnight.
Yeah, Monday, Tuesday, and next Saturday again. And thank you so much, Frank.